I'm John Woodward, and it's Wednesday, the 13th of March, 2024. Welcome to the 7-Minute Briefing Podcast, your monthly roundup of news from the Middle East and North Africa, brought to you by Sat7. The Holy Land and Sudan continued to suffer ruinous wars this month. In Sudan, the World Food Programme estimates that 18 million people face acute hunger and 5 million trapped behind the front lines face starvation. As the Muslim month of Ramadan approached last week, international efforts to end both conflicts were intensifying. Last week, a UN resolution was drafted calling on all warring parties in Sudan to cease fighting and allow full, rapid and safe humanitarian access in all areas. Mediation efforts in Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain have so far failed to make peace between the rival military forces of de facto president and Sudan Armed Forces leader and the chief of the Rapid Support Forces. The RSF has been accused of ethnically motivated massacres and gang rape in the Darfur region, while the SAF have used air power to bomb civilian areas indiscriminately. Please pray for Sudan's people and for a return to the democratic transition that was underway 3 years ago. Hopes that a 40-day ceasefire between Hamas and Israel was in sight and could be agreed by the start of Ramadan were disappointed last week. Negotiations are set to resume this week. They come as relatives of the estimated 130 surviving hostages still held by Hamas pleaded with the Israeli government to do all in its power to release them. In Gaza, the crisis reached a new level as famine took hold. Almost no aid has reached the north of the enclave, and deliveries across the strip fell by half last month due to security constraints and regular border crossing closures. Bombing by Israel continued at a reduced level, while its army has so far held off a threatened ground invasion in Rafah. NGOs say this would be catastrophic for the 1.3 million mostly displaced people who have taken refuge there. Among them is Dalia, a teenage girl who told Sat7 about her hopes to finish her education and be part of future efforts to rebuild her devastated homeland. Children need safety. They need to return to their schools and see their friends, Dalia, 17, told Sat7 Arabic's You Are Not Alone programme. I ask that they stop the war. The children and women are fed up. We need provisions and safe places to live. Consider the children who are homeless and stop the war. Meanwhile, as the UK prepares for an election year, political tensions over the rights to protest about the conflict have increased. The Observer, reporting on the rise in both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, highlighted a poll commissioned by More in Common that found 9% of Britons have negative views about Jews and 21% about Muslims. Calls for revenge can be deafening in the Middle East and North Africa, where lives are regularly torn apart by national conflicts, community tensions and personal feuds. But Sat7 is sharing a radically different message through the stories of Christians who choose to follow Christ's call to forgive their enemies. In this episode's show notes, you will find links to a video sharing Dalia's story and an article on how a Lebanese woman forgives her father's killer. Back to the briefing now, where we should not forget Syria. Although out of the mainstream news, millions remain displaced abroad and in neighbouring countries. According to a new UN report, those who return, including increasing numbers forcibly transferred by host countries, risk serious abuses by the Syrian government, by de facto authorities and by armed groups. They include arbitrary detention, torture and ill treatment, sexual and gender-based violence, enforced disappearance and abduction. Returnees also share the economic hardships of much of the population for whom rocketing inflation makes basic foods and medicines unaffordable. Some choose to take serious risks to make ends meet. February to April is a traditional time for foraging for valuable truffles in the Syrian desert, but the area is also a hideout for jihadist groups. Over 30 foragers were killed in 2 incidents in the last month, some by a mine left by so-called Islamic State, and others in an attack by suspected IS fighters. To Iran now, where the Persian New Year, known as Nowruz, begins with the spring equinox on the 20th of March. Despite elections that took place at the start of the month, however, citizens in Iran expect to see little change in their country's politics. According to many observers, the most significant thing about last month's elections was the record low turnout, estimated at around 41% nationally and much lower in Tehran. In a nation where authorities traditionally point to the elections as a sign of public support, some chose to boycott them as a form of protest. In the same week that Iran's leaders were urging citizens to go out and vote, authorities gave a 3-year, 8-month prison sentence to Shervin Hajipour, the musician whose song became the anthem of the Women, Life, Freedom movement. This month also saw important calls to end human rights violations, including the persecution of Christians in Iran. In his final report on human rights there, UN Special Rapporteur Javed Rahman urged Iran to end criminalisation of the peaceful expression of faith of Christian converts and other religious minorities. Rahman called for Article 13 of the Iranian constitution, which recognises Jews, Zoroastrians and Armenian and Assyrian Christians, to be amended to guarantee freedom of religion or belief to everyone. Pray that these recommendations will be heard and that God will bring about a change of heart in Iranian leaders. See the show notes for a link to read more about how Sat7 is supporting persecuted Christians in some of the world's most hostile places. And finally, this month saw the inauguration of the world's third largest mosque in Algeria. The mosque is intended to promote moderate Islam in a country that endured a decade of conflict between the army and Islamists in the 1990s. Its cost of $898 million has brought criticism, as authorities continue to ignore applications for church premises and have closed 43 of the country's 47 Protestant churches. The closures are understandably having an impact on Algerian believers. I got baptised in my church, said Fatima, an Algerian Sat7 viewer, but life is becoming harder after churches were closed down. I learned so much from your teachings. I can see my life changing. I am growing in faith. I now know how to pray and read the Bible. I am thankful to God for Sat7. Thank you for listening to the 7-Minute Briefing podcast from Sat7. Do take a look at today's show notes to read, listen to, and watch more content connected to this month's news. And don't forget to subscribe, as next month we'll be bringing you an extended briefing from Sat7's annual partnership gathering, brought to you from Cyprus.